Fired for being too poor. The receptionist used her last day to expose a major scam to the CEO and turned the whole game around. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Grace Miller never imagined that being fired would become the greatest moment of her life. For 22 months, she had been the invisible heart of Hill Industries, managing impossible schedules while eating dollar store soup, watching million-dollar deals unfold, while counting every penny of her own survival. When Vivian Holloway called her unsuitable for company image, Grace realized the image needed examining. Armed with nothing but her sharp mind and the financial irregularities she had quietly observed, Grace made a choice that would shake the foundations of corporate power. She would use her last day not to pack her belongings, but to expose a fraud so massive it threatened to destroy everything. What she discovered would transform her from overlooked to essential, from powerless to unstoppable. Sometimes the truth needs someone brave enough to speak it, even when everything is at stake. Sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected battle for justice. This is the story of a woman who turned her greatest humiliation into her most powerful weapon. Grace Elizabeth Miller pressed the phone against her ear while simultaneously updating 3 calendar appointments, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with mathematical precision. The number 14 had become her constant companion. 14 minutes until Mr. Hill's conference call with Singapore, 14 days until rent was due, 14 months since her mother's funeral had left her drowning in medical debt. Hill Industries, this is Grace speaking. How may I assist you today? Her voice carried its usual warmth, a professional melody that masked the careful calculations running beneath every interaction. The caller needed to reschedule their appointment with Mr. Hill, the third such request this morning. Grace navigated the impossible puzzle of his calendar, finding a solution where none seemed to exist. Behind her, the elevator chimed softly, releasing its cargo of perfectly dressed executives into the marble lobby. Grace recognized each by their footsteps alone. Mr. Vance's confident stride, always precisely timed, Miss Holloway's sharp clicks that announced her presence like a warning bell. But it was the steady, measured pace approaching her desk that made Grace straighten unconsciously. "Good morning, Miss Miller." Liam Hill's voice held that quality she had noticed from her very first day, authority tempered with genuine respect. Unlike others who looked through her as if she were office furniture, he actually saw her. "Good morning, Mr. Hill. Your 9:30 with the Healthcare Consortium has moved to 10:15, but I was able to preserve your lunch with the board members by shifting the product development review to tomorrow morning." Grace handed him a revised schedule, their fingers brushing briefly as he accepted the paper. "How do you do it?" He paused, studying the reorganized appointments. "This schedule was impossible yesterday." "Nothing is impossible, sir. Some puzzles just require more creative thinking." The response came naturally, though Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. She rarely received compliments for work that had become as natural as breathing. Liam nodded thoughtfully before disappearing into his private elevator, leaving Grace with an unfamiliar flutter of recognition. In 22 months of employment, their exchanges had been brief but consistently courteous. A professional relationship built on mutual respect despite the vast difference in their positions. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm until Grace noticed something that made her pause mid-keystroke. A financial document had been accidentally included in Mr. Vance's correspondence folder, one that showed investment figures that did not align with the company reports she had processed last week. The numbers were subtle, almost invisible unless someone possessed her particular attention to detail, honed by years of tracking insurance claims and medical bills to the penny. Grace studied the document more carefully, her mind automatically cataloguing the discrepancies. $3.7 million in client investments showing two different destinations. Her stomach tightened with recognition. This was the same feeling she had experienced when reviewing her mother's hospital bills, that sinking awareness that something was deliberately hidden. Miss Miller. Vivian Holloway's voice cut through her concentration like ice water. "I need to see you in my office immediately." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she saved her work and followed Miss Holloway's rigid posture toward the Human Resources Department. The walk felt endless, each step echoing against polished floors that suddenly seemed as cold as a courtroom. Miss Holloway's office reflected her personality, stark, colorless, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Grace took the offered seat, noticing how the chair placed her slightly lower than the imposing desk, a subtle power dynamic she had never noticed before today. "Miss Miller, after careful consideration, we have decided to terminate your employment with Hill Industries." The words fell like stones, each one precisely calculated for maximum impact. "Your final day will be today." Grace felt the world tilt slightly. "May I ask why? My performance reviews have always been excellent, and I have never received any complaints about my work." "This is not about performance." Miss Holloway's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "It is about image. Hill Industries has grown into a prestigious organization, and we must ensure that all our employees reflect the sophisticated image we present to our clients and partners." The meaning landed like a physical blow. Grace's modest clothing from department store sales, her careful budgeting, her lack of expensive accessories, all of it was being labeled as inadequate. She was being fired not for incompetence, but for being too poor to fit their corporate aesthetic. "I understand," Grace said quietly, though understanding felt like swallowing broken glass. "When should I clear my desk?" "Security will escort you out at the end of the business day. Please ensure all company materials are returned." Miss Holloway was already looking at other papers, dismissing Grace as if she had already ceased to exist. Grace walked back to her desk in a strange state of clarity. The humiliation burned, but beneath it, something else was stirring, a determination she had not felt since her mother's final days in the hospital, when Grace had fought insurance companies and billing departments with relentless persistence. She looked at her computer screen, then at the financial document still sitting beside her keyboard. 22 months of careful observation had taught her things that went far beyond scheduling appointments and managing phone calls. She had seen patterns, noticed inconsistencies, and filed away details that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a troubling picture. Grace pulled up her personal notepad and began writing, her training in business administration suddenly feeling more valuable than it had in years. If this was truly her last day, she would make it count for something more than self-pity. The afternoon light slanted through the lobby windows as Grace methodically documented every financial irregularity she had noticed, every suspicious conversation she had overheard, every document that had passed through her hands containing numbers that did not quite add up. Her mother had taught her that integrity was not about convenience. It was about doing the right thing, even when it cost everything. By 5 o'clock, Grace had assembled a preliminary case that made her hands shake with its implications. The theft was not just significant, it was massive, sophisticated, and if she was correct, still ongoing. She looked toward Mr. Hill's office, knowing that security would arrive soon to escort her from the building forever. Grace Elizabeth Miller had always been invisible in this corporate world. Today, she realized that invisibility had given her the perfect vantage point to witness something that could destroy everything. The question was whether she possessed enough courage to ensure someone listened before it was too late. Grace stared at the evidence spread across her desk, her heart hammering with the weight of what she had discovered. The financial discrepancies formed a pattern so clear that she wondered how she had missed its significance before. $12.7 million moving through accounts that officially did not exist, client payments disappearing into offshore arrangements that had no legitimate business purpose. Her computer screen showed Mr. Hill's schedule, 6:30 conference call with London, followed by a brief window before his 7:15 dinner meeting. Grace had managed his calendar long enough to recognize the spaces between obligations, the rare moments when he might actually listen to something this explosive. The elevator chimed, and Grace watched Dominic Vance emerge with his characteristic confidence. Even now, studying him with new awareness, she could see nothing in his polished appearance that suggested criminality. That, she realized, was precisely what made him so dangerous. "Miss Miller," his voice carried its usual charm, "I trust you are managing the transition smoothly." The question felt loaded with meaning. Grace wondered how much he knew about her termination, how much he had influenced the decision. "Yes, Mr. Vance, everything is proceeding as expected." "Excellent. I would hate for there to be any unnecessary complications on your final day." He smiled, but Grace noticed that it never reached his eyes. "I am certain you understand the importance of maintaining confidentiality regarding all company matters, even after your departure." "Of course." Grace kept her voice steady, though her pulse quickened. Was this a warning? A threat? Or simply standard corporate protocol delivered with unfortunate timing? After Mr. Vance disappeared into his office, Grace gathered her documentation and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. She was going to request a private meeting with Liam Hill, Chief Executive Officer of Hill Industries, to present evidence that one of his most trusted executives was systematically stealing from the company. The executive elevator required a key card, but Grace knew the building's operational patterns better than anyone. At 6:45, when Mr. Hill's London call concluded, she positioned herself near the elevator bank with a stack of legitimate correspondence that needed his signature. "Miss Miller." Liam looked surprised to see her on the executive floor. "I thought security was escorting departing employees at 5 o'clock. They granted me additional time to complete some final administrative tasks," Grace said, which was technically true. "Mr. Hill, I need to speak with you about something urgent, something that affects the company's financial security." His expression shifted from polite interest to focused attention. "That sounds serious. Please, come into my office." Liam Hill's corner office reflected his personality, successful but not ostentatious, organized but lived in, with family photographs that suggested depth beyond corporate achievement. Grace had been inside only twice during her employment, both times to deliver urgent documents, and she had never been invited to sit down. "What kind of financial security issue?" Liam settled behind his desk, giving Grace his complete attention in a way that felt both intimidating and encouraging. Grace opened her folder, her hands steadier than she had expected. "For the past several months, I have noticed discrepancies in financial documents that pass through my desk. Initially, I assumed they were clerical errors, but the pattern has become too consistent to ignore." She laid out copies of the most damaging evidence: investment reports showing payments to shell companies, client account summaries that did not match deposit records, expense reports for business activities that had never appeared on any executive calendar. Liam examined each document carefully, his expression growing more serious with every page. "These are serious allegations, Miss Miller. Are you certain about these calculations? I have verified every figure multiple times. The total discrepancy over the past 18 months exceeds $12 million. Grace's voice gained strength as she spoke. "Someone has been systematically diverting client investments and company funds through a network of false partnerships and fictional business expenses. Who has access to these particular accounts?" Liam's question was sharp, focused, based on the document routing. Only someone with vice president level authorization could execute transfers of this magnitude without additional oversight. Grace met his eyes directly. The evidence suggests Dominic Vance is orchestrating a sophisticated theft operation using the company's legitimate investment activities as cover. The silence stretched between them, loaded with implications that could destroy careers, trigger criminal investigations, and potentially bring down the company itself. Grace watched Liam process not just the financial evidence, but the reality that someone he trusted completely had been betraying that trust for over a year. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" Liam asked finally. "Because it is the right thing to do." Grace's response came without hesitation. "Because $12 million belongs to your clients and your company, not to whoever is stealing it. And because tomorrow I will no longer work here, so this is my last opportunity to speak up." Liam leaned back in his chair, studying Grace with new interest. "Miss Holloway mentioned that you were being terminated for image reasons. I assume you are aware that bringing allegations like this could be seen as retaliation from a disgruntled employee." The question stung, but Grace had expected it. "Yes, sir. I am aware that my timing makes me appear vindictive, but the evidence exists regardless of my employment status, and someone needs to investigate before more money disappears. These are photocopies. Where are the original documents? Most have been returned to their normal filing systems. I kept copies because the discrepancies troubled me, but I did not want to remove original company property." Grace's careful ethics were evident in every detail of her presentation. Liam stood and walked to his window, looking out over the city lights that sparkled like scattered diamonds. "If you are correct, this represents the largest theft in our company's history. If you are wrong, you are accusing a respected executive of serious crimes based on circumstantial evidence." "I understand the gravity of what I am suggesting," Grace replied, "but I also understand that $12 million does not disappear by accident. Someone made deliberate decisions to steal that money, and they are still making those decisions every day, that nothing is done to stop them." When Liam turned back to face her, Grace saw something in his expression that had not been there before, a recognition that went beyond their professional relationship, an acknowledgement of the courage it had taken for her to walk into his office with evidence that could destroy her credibility forever. "I will need time to review this thoroughly and discreetly verify your findings," he said finally. "Can you be available tomorrow if I have additional questions?" "I will not be an employee tomorrow, but I will be available to assist the investigation in any way possible." Grace gathered her copies, leaving the originals on his desk. "Mr. Hill, I know this is difficult to believe, especially about someone you trust. But the numbers do not lie, and they are telling a story that someone hoped would never be heard." As Grace prepared to leave, Liam spoke again. "Miss Miller, regardless of the outcome of this investigation, I want you to know that I respect the integrity it took to bring this forward. That kind of character is rare in any environment." Grace felt tears threaten for the first time that day, but they were not tears of sadness. For the first time in 22 months, someone had seen her not as invisible furniture, but as a person whose judgment and character were worth respecting. Walking toward the elevator, Grace realized she had just changed the trajectory of her life forever. Tomorrow, she would either be vindicated as a hero or dismissed as a desperate woman making false accusations. But tonight, she had done something her mother would have been proud of. She had chosen truth over safety, justice over silence. The elevator doors closed, and Grace descended toward whatever consequences awaited her decision to speak truth to power. Grace arrived at Hill Industries 45 minutes early, though she was no longer officially employed. The security guard recognized her and nodded sympathetically, unaware that she carried information that could reshape the entire company. She had spent the evening organizing her evidence into a comprehensive presentation, anticipating every question Liam might ask. Her replacement had not yet arrived, leaving the reception desk empty and somehow smaller than it had seemed yesterday. Grace settled into the lobby's visitor seating area, watching the familiar morning ritual of executives arriving with their coffee and confidence, unchanged by the earth-shifting conversation that had occurred in the corner office 12 hours earlier. At precisely 8:30, Grace's phone buzzed with a text message from Liam. "Can you meet me in conference room B at 9? Please use the visitor entrance." The formality of the message told Grace everything she needed to know about the seriousness with which he was treating her allegations. Conference room B was where the company conducted sensitive meetings with external investigators and legal counsel. Grace spent the intervening 30 minutes reviewing her documentation one final time, ensuring that every figure was precise and every conclusion was supported by verifiable evidence. Her business administration training had taught her the importance of presenting complex financial information clearly, and today that education would be tested in ways her professors had never imagined. Conference room B felt different from the rest of Hill Industries, sterile, designed for difficult conversations that required privacy and careful documentation. Liam was already present when Grace arrived, along with two people she did not recognize, a woman in a navy suit who emanated legal authority, and a man whose careful attention to detail suggested accounting expertise. "Miss Miller, thank you for coming in. This is Sarah Chen, our external legal counsel, and Michael Torres from our independent auditing firm. I have shared your findings with them, and we need to discuss the next steps very carefully." Grace took the offered seat, acutely aware that this meeting would determine whether she was taken seriously as a whistleblower or dismissed as a vindictive former employee. The distinction would define not just the investigation's credibility, but her own future in the business world. Sarah Chen spoke first, her voice crisp and professional. "Miss Miller, we need to establish a clear timeline of when and how you observed these financial irregularities. Your employment status complicates the legal implications, so precision is essential." Grace opened her notebook, grateful for the detailed records she had kept. "I first noticed numerical discrepancies in March, when investment reports showed client funds being transferred to partnerships that were not mentioned in any board meeting minutes I processed. Initially, I assumed these were legitimate business arrangements I simply had not been informed about. What changed your assessment?" Michael Torres's question focused on the analytical process rather than the personal drama. The pattern became too consistent to ignore. Every month, approximately $2 to $3 million would appear in reports as investment income, but the same amounts would disappear through expense reports for partnerships that had no apparent business activity. I began keeping copies when I realized the discrepancies were systematic rather than accidental. Liam leaned forward. "Miss Miller, yesterday you mentioned that only vice president level authorization could execute these transfers. Can you explain how you reached that conclusion? Document routing protocols require specific authorization levels for different transaction amounts. Transfers exceeding $1 million require either CEO approval or 2 vice president signatures. Since these transactions were not appearing in your approval queue, and Mr. Vance was the only vice president signing off on multiple large transfers to the same partner organizations, the logical conclusion was his involvement." Sarah Chen made detailed notes as Grace spoke. "Miss Miller, are you aware that these allegations, if proven false, could result in significant legal consequences for you personally?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm also aware that if these allegations are true, $12 million of client money has been stolen, and more theft is likely occurring every day we delay investigation." Grace's response carried quiet conviction. I would rather face legal consequences for speaking truth than moral consequences for remaining silent. Michael Torres spread several documents across the conference table. Miss Miller, I have been able to verify several of your calculations using our independent access to company financial records. The discrepancies you identified are mathematically accurate. What concerns me is the sophistication of the concealment methods. Meaning, Liam's question reflected growing alarm. Meaning, this is not opportunistic theft by someone with access to company accounts. This is a carefully planned operation by someone who understands our financial systems well enough to exploit gaps in oversight procedures. Someone who has been planning this for months, possibly years. The room fell silent as the implications settled. Grace had not just discovered theft, she'd uncovered evidence of a long-term criminal enterprise operating within Hill Industries' most trusted leadership level. What is our next step? Liam's question was directed primarily at Sarah Chen. We need to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit without alerting the suspected individual. This investigation must be completed quickly and quietly, before additional evidence can be destroyed or additional funds can be transferred. Sarah looked directly at Grace. Miss Miller, your cooperation will be essential, but your involvement also creates legal complexities we need to address carefully. I will cooperate fully with any investigation, Grace replied without hesitation. My only interest is ensuring that the truth is discovered and that no additional theft occurs. Liam stood and walked to the window, his expression troubled. If Dominic is responsible for this, it represents a personal betrayal as much as a criminal one. I brought him into this company. I trusted him with our most sensitive financial operations, and I recommended him to our board of directors as my potential successor. Grace felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the man whose world was being shattered by her revelations. Mr. Hill, sophisticated criminals succeed by appearing trustworthy. The fact that Mr. Vance deceived you does not reflect poorly on your judgment. It reflects his skill at deception. Their eyes met across the conference table, and Grace saw something that had not been there before, a recognition of her not just as a source of information, but as an ally in seeking justice. For the first time since her termination, Grace felt that she was being seen as valuable rather than disposable. Michael Torres began packing his documents. I will begin the forensic audit immediately. Miss Miller, we will need you to provide detailed statements about every document and transaction you observed. This process may take several days. Miss Miller, Sarah Chen added, given the sensitive nature of this investigation, I strongly recommend that you avoid any contact with Dominic Vance or anyone who might report your activities to him. Your safety could become a concern if he realizes the scope of our investigation. The word safety sent a chill through Grace that had nothing to do with the conference room's air conditioning. She had been thinking about justice and integrity, but she had not considered that exposing a $12 million theft might put her in actual danger. Liam seemed to recognize her concern. Miss Miller, if you need any additional security measures or if anyone approaches you with questions about this investigation, please contact me immediately. Your courage in bringing this forward deserves our protection, not additional risk. As the meeting concluded, Grace realized that her life had been fundamentally altered in ways she was only beginning to understand. Yesterday, she had been an invisible receptionist. Today, she was a key witness in what could become one of the largest corporate fraud cases in the city's recent history. Walking toward the elevator, Grace felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She had chosen truth over comfort, justice over security, and integrity over invisibility. Now she would discover what those choices truly cost, and whether courage was enough to see them through to the end. Grace spent the morning in Conference Room B, providing detailed testimony about 22 months of observations that had seemed insignificant until viewed through the lens of systematic theft. Sarah Chen's questions were thorough and methodical, building a legal case that could withstand the scrutiny of both corporate lawyers and criminal prosecutors. Miss Miller, you mentioned that Mr. Vance always personally handled documents related to these partnership agreements. Did you ever observe him taking unusual precautions with specific paperwork? Sarah's legal training was evident in the precision of her inquiries. Yes, partnership reports were always sealed in envelopes before being given to me for filing, unlike other financial documents that pass through my desk in standard folders. And Mr. Vance always retrieved those files personally, rather than allowing normal filing protocols. Grace's memory for administrative details was proving invaluable to the investigation. Michael Torres looked up from his laptop, where he had been cross-referencing Grace's testimony with financial records. Miss Miller, your observations about timing are particularly significant. The discrepancies you noticed coincide exactly with the dates when Dominic Vance had sole authorization to approve partnership expenditures while Liam was traveling. Liam's expression darkened as the pattern became clear. He was using my absence to execute transfers that would normally require my additional approval. My travel schedule for the past year has been coordinated through Miss Miller's calendar management. Grace felt a chill of realization. Mr. Vance always seemed particularly interested in your travel plans. He would ask me about changes to your schedule, especially international trips that would make you unavailable during business hours. He was timing the thefts to coincide with periods when detection would be most difficult, Sarah concluded. This level of planning indicates premeditation and sophisticated criminal intent. The conference room door opened, and Liam's assistant entered with an expression of barely controlled panic. Mr. Hill, I apologize for the interruption, but there is an urgent situation developing. Dominic Vance has called an emergency press conference for 2 o'clock this afternoon. He is claiming that a disgruntled former employee is making false accusations against the company, and he wants to address the situation publicly before rumors damage our corporate reputation. The words hit the room like physical blows. Grace felt her stomach plummet as the implications became clear. Somehow, Dominic had learned about the investigation and was moving to discredit her before the evidence could be properly examined. How could he know about our investigation? Liam's question was directed at Sarah Chen, but his eyes found Grace's face with concern rather than suspicion. Corporate investigations are difficult to keep completely confidential, Sarah replied grimly. He may have noticed unusual auditing activity, or someone may have inadvertently mentioned the forensic review. Grace felt the room spinning around her as she realized what was happening. He is going to destroy my credibility before the evidence can be verified. Once I am labeled as a vindictive former employee making false accusations, no one will believe the financial evidence, no matter how accurate it is. Michael Torres was already on his phone, speaking rapidly to his forensic team. We need to expedite the audit immediately. If Dominic is moving this quickly, he may also be attempting to transfer or destroy additional evidence. Liam stood abruptly, his decision-making process accelerating to match the crisis. Sarah, can we obtain a legal injunction to prevent him from making public statements that could prejudice any potential criminal investigation? Not without revealing the scope of our investigation, which could compromise evidence gathering, Sarah replied. We are caught between protecting Miss Miller's reputation and protecting the integrity of the financial investigation. Grace felt tears threatening, but they were tears of frustration rather than self-pity. He is using my termination and my financial situation against me. He knows that anyone hearing his version of events will believe that poverty makes me dishonest rather than careful. Miss Miller, Liam's voice cut through her despair with unexpected strength. I have spent the morning reviewing your evidence and listening to your testimony. Your integrity and attention to detail are beyond question. We will not allow Dominic to destroy the truth by attacking your character. Sarah Chen was taking notes rapidly. We need to consider going public with our own statement, but that carries significant risks. Once this becomes a media battle, the legal complexities multiply exponentially. Grace stared at the conference table, seeing her future crumbling before the investigation had even been completed. Everything she had feared about speaking up was coming true. She would be painted as a desperate woman, making vindictive accusations, while the real criminal positioned himself as the victim of false charges. There is another option, Grace said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. I could face the press conference directly. Let Mr. Vance make his accusations in public, where I can respond with facts rather than hiding behind lawyers and investigations. The suggestion sent a wave of alarm through the room. Sarah Chen immediately shook her head. Absolutely not. Public statements at this stage could compromise both the criminal investigation and any civil actions. You could inadvertently say something that undermines the entire case. But Liam was studying Grace with something that looked like admiration. Miss Miller, that would require extraordinary courage. Are you prepared for the kind of public scrutiny that comes with challenging someone like Dominic in front of reporters? Grace thought about her mother, who had faced terminal cancer with quiet dignity, never complaining about the financial burden or the unfairness of her situation. My mother taught me that integrity is not about convenience. It is about doing what is right even when everything seems stacked against you. The risks are enormous, Sarah warned. If you make any statements that cannot be proven immediately, Dominic's legal team will use them to portray you as unstable and vindictive. Grace looked around the room at the three people who had taken her seriously when she could have been dismissed as an angry former employee. Yesterday I was invisible. Today I have the opportunity to speak truth in front of the entire city. Maybe that is worth the risk. Michael Torres received a phone call that made his expression even more urgent. The forensic audit has uncovered additional irregularities. We are now looking at potential theft exceeding $15 million. This is no longer just corporate fraud. This is criminal enterprise. The stakes had risen beyond anything Grace had imagined when she first noticed numerical discrepancies. She was no longer just a former employee with suspicions. She was a key witness in what could become one of the largest white-collar crime cases in the state's recent history. Liam met her eyes across the conference table. Miss Miller, whatever you decide, you will have our full support. Your courage in bringing this forward has already changed everything. Grace realized that she stood at the crossroads between safety and truth, between invisibility and consequence. In 2 hours, she would discover whether speaking up had been the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish. But her mother had not raised her to choose safety over integrity, and she would not start now. The press conference would determine whether Grace Elizabeth Miller remained invisible or became the voice that exposed $15 million in corporate theft. Either way, there was no going back to the quiet desperation of her reception desk. She had chosen truth, and now truth would choose her fate. The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock, giving Grace exactly 90 minutes to prepare for the most important conversation of her life. Conference Room B had been transformed into a war room, with Sarah Chen coordinating legal strategy while Michael Torres compiled the most damning evidence from his accelerated forensic audit. Miss Miller, if you are determined to do this, we need to establish very clear boundaries about what you can and cannot say publicly. Sarah's legal training was evident in every word. Any statement that cannot be immediately verified could be used to discredit your entire testimony. Grace sat at the conference table, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. I understand the risks, but I also understand that $15 million has been stolen, and Mr. Vance is about to convince everyone that I am the real problem." Liam paced near the window, his expression reflecting the internal struggle between protecting Grace and protecting the investigation. "Dominic is brilliant at manipulation. He will use your employment termination, your financial situation, and your lack of formal business credentials to paint you as unreliable. Then I will use facts to paint him as a thief," Grace replied with quiet determination. "Numbers do not lie, regardless of who presents them." Michael Torres looked up from his laptop, his expression grim. "The forensic audit has revealed something even more disturbing. The theft operation appears to have been operational for at least 3 years, possibly longer. We are looking at potential losses exceeding $20 million. The figure hit the room like a physical blow. Grace felt her breath catch as she realized the true scope of what she had uncovered. This was not opportunistic theft. This was a systematic criminal enterprise that had been operating under everyone's watch for years. Sarah Chen's phone rang, and her expression became increasingly serious as she listened. "The press conference has been moved to the main lobby. Dominic has invited financial reporters from 3 major publications and 2 television stations. This is going to be a media circus." Grace's stomach tightened with anxiety, but her resolve remained firm. "How many people will be watching?" "Potentially thousands, if the television coverage goes live," Liam answered. "Miss Miller, you need to understand that once you walk into that lobby, your life will never be private again. Win or lose, you will become a public figure in this story." Grace thought about the 22 months she had spent being invisible, watching important decisions happen around her while she managed schedules and answered phones. "Maybe it is time for me to be visible." Sarah Chen spread documents across the table, organizing the evidence that could support Grace's public statements. "These are the facts you can state with absolute certainty. Anything beyond these specific figures moves into speculation, which Dominic's lawyers will use to destroy your credibility." Grace studied the evidence with the same attention to detail that had first revealed the financial discrepancies. $23 million in questionable transfers, 47 shell companies used to disguise theft, investment reports showing phantom partnerships that existed only on paper. "Miss Miller," Michael Torres said carefully, "there is something else you need to know before you face the media. Our investigation has revealed that your termination was not coincidental. Dominic Vance specifically recommended to Vivian Holloway that you be dismissed, citing concerns about your access to sensitive financial documents." The revelation struck Grace like lightning. Her firing had not been about image or company prestige. It had been a calculated move to remove her before she could piece together the evidence of systematic theft. Dominic had recognized her as a threat and arranged her elimination. "He knew that I had noticed the discrepancies," Grace realized aloud. "He was protecting his criminal operation by getting rid of the one person who was in position to observe the patterns." Liam's expression hardened with understanding. "Which means everything he is about to say at that press conference is part of a deliberate strategy to discredit the person who poses the greatest threat to his freedom." Sarah Chen checked her watch. "We have 45 minutes before the press conference begins. Miss Miller, I need your absolute commitment that you will stick to verifiable facts, no matter how aggressive his accusations become." Grace stood up, her decision crystallized by the revelation that her termination had been orchestrated specifically to silence her. "I will present the evidence and let the facts speak for themselves. If Mr. Vance wants to make this a public battle between his reputation and the truth, then the truth needs someone willing to defend it." The next 30 minutes passed in intensive preparation, with Sarah coaching Grace on handling hostile questions, while Michael ensured that every figure in her presentation could be verified immediately. Liam made phone calls to board members, preparing them for the media storm that was about to engulf Hill Industries. At 1:50 Grace walked toward the main lobby, carrying a folder of evidence that could expose one of the largest corporate thefts in the city's recent memory. Her hands were steady, her voice was clear, and her resolve was unshakable. The lobby had been transformed into a media battleground, with television cameras, reporters, and corporate executives creating an atmosphere of barely controlled tension. Dominic Vance stood at a temporary podium, projecting confidence and injured dignity as he prepared to destroy her reputation before she could destroy his freedom. Grace took her position at the back of the crowd, waiting for her moment to step forward and challenge $23 million worth of lies with nothing but truth, courage, and an invisible woman's perfect attention to detail. In 60 seconds, Grace Elizabeth Miller would discover whether speaking truth to power was enough to overcome money, influence, and sophisticated manipulation. She had spent 22 months being overlooked. Now she would find out what happened when the overlooked refused to be silenced. The press conference was about to begin, and with it, the most important battle of Grace's life. Grace stepped into the lobby's blazing television lights, her folder of evidence clutched against her chest like armor. The assembled reporters turned toward her with the predatory attention of sharks sensing blood, their cameras capturing every detail of the woman who was about to challenge one of the city's most respected executives. Dominic Vance commanded the podium with practiced authority, his platinum hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating wounded dignity. Ladies and gentlemen, I have called this press conference to address serious allegations being made against Hill Industries by a recently terminated employee. These accusations are not only false, but they represent a deliberate attempt to damage our company's reputation through vindictive fabrication. Grace felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady when she called out from the crowd. "Mr. Vance, would you be willing to address those allegations in the presence of the person who made them?" The question cut through the lobby like electricity. Reporters spun toward Grace, recognizing the dramatic potential of a direct confrontation. Dominic's confident expression flickered for just a moment before reassembling into practiced charm. "Miss Miller, I had hoped you would use this time to seek professional help rather than continuing to spread harmful rumors." His voice carried perfectly modulated concern, as if speaking to someone whose mental stability was questionable. "Your recent termination for performance issues clearly created emotional distress that has led to these unfortunate accusations." Performance issues? Grace stepped closer to the podium, her 22 months of invisibility evaporating with each word. "Or concerns about my access to financial documents that revealed $23 million in fraudulent transfers to shell companies." The number landed like a bomb in the lobby. Reporters began shouting questions. Cameras swiveled between Grace and Dominic, and the carefully controlled press conference devolved into chaos. Grace seized the moment, raising her voice with authority she had never known she possessed. "I have documented evidence of systematic theft spanning 3 years, involving 47 shell companies and investment partnerships that exist only on paper. Mr. Vance has been systematically diverting client funds through offshore accounts while using Hill Industries' legitimate business operations as cover." Dominic's mask finally slipped, revealing a flash of genuine anger before snapping back into place. Miss Miller's desperation is understandable but tragic. Facing unemployment and financial hardship, she has constructed an elaborate fantasy to explain her professional failures. Then you would not object to an independent forensic audit of the partnership agreements you have personally authorized over the past 3 years. Grace's question was delivered with surgical precision, backed by evidence that had been verified by experts. The lobby fell silent except for the whisper of television cameras recording every moment. Grace realized that this was her one opportunity to present the truth, before Dominic's superior resources and media connections could bury her credibility forever. Channel 7 News, Jessica Martinez, one reporter called out. Miss Miller, do you have specific evidence to support these allegations, or are you asking us to take your word against a respected executive's reputation? Grace opened her folder, her hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I have copies of investment reports showing client funds transferred to partnerships that have no legitimate business addresses, no verifiable business activities, and no corporate registrations with the state. I have expense reports for business travel that never appeared on any executive calendar, and partnership agreements signed exclusively by Mr. Vance without board oversight. She held up documents as she spoke, each piece of evidence corresponding to specific allegations that could be verified immediately. Her business administration training had taught her the importance of supporting every claim with documentation, and today that education was her weapon. Dominic moved to regain control of the narrative, but Grace had found her voice and would not be silenced. Furthermore, I have documented evidence that my termination was specifically orchestrated by Mr. Vance to prevent me from reporting these discrepancies. My dismissal was not about performance or image. It was about silencing a witness to corporate theft. The accusation sent another ripple of excitement through the assembled reporters. Grace could see Dominic's strategy crumbling as his attempt to portray her as vindictive backfired against her methodical presentation of facts. Miss Miller, another reporter shouted, what do you hope to accomplish with these allegations? Justice, Grace replied without hesitation. $23 million belongs to Hill Industries' clients and shareholders, not to whoever has been stealing it. My goal is to ensure that theft stops and that the money is returned to its rightful owners. Behind the crowd of reporters, Grace caught sight of Liam watching the confrontation with an expression of quiet admiration. Their eyes met across the chaos, and she saw something that gave her strength, recognition that she was fighting not just for vindication, but for principles they both believed in. Dominic made one final attempt to regain control. Miss Miller's accusations will be investigated thoroughly by our legal department. I'm confident that a proper review will reveal the truth about both the financial allegations and the motivations behind them. Then you support an immediate independent audit by external investigators. Grace's question trapped Dominic between appearing guilty if he refused and accepting an investigation that would expose his crimes if he agreed. Of course, Dominic replied smoothly, though Grace detected tension in his voice. Hill Industries has nothing to hide from legitimate investigation. Grace smiled, recognizing that she had just won the most important victory of the confrontation. On live television, in front of financial reporters from major publications, Dominic Vance had just agreed to the very investigation that would prove his guilt. As reporters began shouting follow-up questions and cameras captured the dramatic conclusion of the press conference, Grace realized that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer invisible, no longer powerless, and no longer afraid of speaking truth, regardless of the consequences. Walking toward the elevator, Grace felt a presence beside her and turned to find Liam matching her pace. Miss Miller, that was extraordinary. You just did something that most people would never have the courage to attempt. I had good preparation, Grace replied, though her heart was racing with the aftermath of adrenaline and the proximity of the man whose respect had become unexpectedly important to her. You had more than preparation, Liam said quietly. You had integrity, and that made all the difference. The elevator doors closed, carrying Grace toward whatever consequences awaited her decision to challenge power with nothing but truth and unwavering determination. But for the first time in her adult life, she felt visible, valuable, and victorious. The Hill Industries boardroom had been transformed into a crisis management center, with lawyers, investigators, and executives working through the media firestorm that Grace's press conference had ignited. Within 3 hours, financial news networks were running continuous coverage of the allegations, and Hill Industries' stock price had dropped 12%. Grace sat at the polished conference table, no longer the invisible receptionist, but the key witness in what was rapidly becoming one of the year's most significant corporate scandal stories. Sarah Chen was fielding calls from federal investigators, while Michael Torres coordinated with additional forensic accounting firms to handle the expanded investigation. Miss Miller, your performance at the press conference was legally risky, but strategically brilliant, Sarah said, ending another call with the Securities and Exchange Commission. By forcing Dominic to agree to independent investigation on live television, you eliminated his ability to delay or obstruct the audit process. Liam paced near the windows, his usual composed demeanor strained by the crisis engulfing his company. The board is demanding answers, the media is speculating about additional corruption, and our clients are questioning whether their investments are secure. We need to move quickly to restore confidence. Grace watched him struggle with the reality that someone he had trusted completely had been systematically betraying that trust for years. She recognized his frustration and felt an unexpected desire to offer comfort that went beyond their professional relationship. Mr. Hill, sophisticated criminals succeed by targeting people with integrity, Grace said gently. Dominic Vance chose Hill Industries specifically because your ethical reputation made you an ideal victim. Your trust was not misplaced, it was exploited. Their eyes met across the conference room, and Grace felt something shift between them. The formal distance that had defined their professional relationship was dissolving, replaced by a partnership forged under extraordinary circumstances. Michael Torres looked up from his laptop with urgent news. The forensic audit has uncovered something massive. We are no longer looking at $23 million in theft. The preliminary numbers suggest losses exceeding $32 million over a 4-year period. The figure hit the room like a physical blow. Grace felt her breath catch as she realized the true scope of what she had uncovered. This was not just corporate fraud. It was one of the largest systematic theft operations in the city's corporate history. Sarah Chen immediately began making calls to federal prosecutors, while Liam sat heavily in his chair, the weight of his company's near destruction settling on his shoulders like lead. Miss Miller, Liam said quietly, if you had not been paying attention, if you had not had the courage to speak up, how much more would he have stolen before anyone noticed? Grace considered the question seriously. Based on the escalation pattern, probably another 15 to 20 million over the next 2 years. And by then, the company might not have survived the losses. The realization that Grace had potentially saved Hill Industries from complete collapse transformed the atmosphere in the room. She was no longer just a witness to crime. She was the person whose careful attention and moral courage had prevented a corporate catastrophe. We need to discuss security arrangements for Miss Miller, Sarah Chen said, returning from her phone calls with a serious expression. Federal investigators are treating this as organized financial crime, and the amounts involved suggest that Dominic may have criminal associates who view Grace as a threat. The word threat sent a chill through Grace that she tried to hide. She had been thinking about justice and truth, but she had not considered that exposing $32 million in theft might make her a target for violence. Liam immediately moved closer to Grace, his protective instincts evident. What kind of security measures are we talking about? Professional protection until Dominic is arrested and charged. Temporary relocation if necessary. We cannot take any chances with Miss Miller's safety, Sarah replied. She is now the star witness in what will likely become a federal criminal case. Grace felt overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of her life from invisible employee to protected witness, but she also felt a strange sense of fulfillment. For the first time in her adult life, her intelligence and attention to detail were being recognized as valuable rather than merely useful. "Miss Miller," Liam said, "I want you to know that Hill Industries will provide whatever protection and support you need throughout this process. Your courage in exposing this theft deserves our gratitude, not additional danger." Their conversation was interrupted by Michael Torres receiving an urgent phone call that made his expression increasingly alarmed. "We have a problem," he said after ending the call. "Dominic Vance has not returned to his office since the press conference, and his assistant reports that he accessed his computer remotely to delete multiple files." The news sent another wave of urgency through the room. Grace realized that her public confrontation had not just exposed the truth, it had also warned Dominic that his criminal operation was being dismantled, giving him time to destroy evidence or escape prosecution. "Can the deleted files be recovered?" Sarah asked immediately. "Our IT department is working on it, but sophisticated criminals often use deletion methods that make recovery difficult or impossible," Michael replied grimly. Grace felt a stab of guilt, wondering if her decision to confront Dominic publicly had compromised the investigation by alerting him to the danger. "Did I make a mistake by challenging him at the press conference?" Liam answered before the lawyers could respond. "You made the only choice that your integrity allowed. Dominic's ability to destroy evidence does not change the fact that $32 million was stolen, and it does not diminish the courage it took for you to expose that theft." Sarah Chen was already coordinating with federal investigators to accelerate the case before additional evidence could be destroyed. Grace realized that she was now at the center of a race between justice and criminal sophistication, between truth and cover-up. As the emergency meeting continued late into the evening, Grace became increasingly aware of Liam's presence beside her, the way his attention focused on her when she spoke, the protective concern in his voice when discussing her safety. Their partnership had evolved beyond professional necessity into something deeper and more personal. When the meeting finally ended at nearly 10 o'clock, Grace and Liam found themselves alone in the conference room, surrounded by the aftermath of evidence and empty coffee cups that marked the day's battle for justice. "Miss Miller," Liam said quietly, "I need you to understand something. What you did today required extraordinary courage, but it also put you in extraordinary danger. I want you to know that you are not facing this alone." Grace felt her heart race at the sincerity in his voice and the recognition that their relationship had fundamentally changed. "Thank you, Mr. Hill. I know that supporting me creates risks for you and the company." "Call me Liam," he said, the formality between them dissolving completely. "And supporting you is not a risk. It is the right thing to do. You saved my company, Grace. You may have saved my entire professional legacy." The use of her first name sent warmth through Grace that had nothing to do with professional gratitude and everything to do with the growing connection between them. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Grace realized that exposing $32 million in theft had not just changed her career prospects, it had brought her closer to a man whose integrity matched her own, and whose respect had become the foundation for something that felt remarkably like the beginning of love. Grace's temporary apartment was a sterile corporate housing unit, chosen by security experts for its controlled access and surveillance capabilities rather than comfort. She sat at the small dining table with her laptop, reviewing additional financial documents that the forensic audit had uncovered, her dedication to the investigation unwavering despite the upheaval in her life. The knock at her door came precisely at 7 in the morning, followed by Liam's voice calling her name. Grace opened the door to find him holding 2 coffee cups from the bakery across the street, his business attire replaced by jeans and a sweater that made him seem more approachable than the powerful executive she had known. "I thought you might need breakfast," he said, offering her one of the cups. "And I wanted to check on how you are handling all of this." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully, touched by the gesture and the genuine concern in his expression. "I slept better than expected, actually. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm doing something meaningful rather than just surviving." They sat across from each other at the small table, the formal distance of their previous relationship replaced by an intimacy that felt both natural and slightly overwhelming. Grace found herself noticing details she had never observed during their brief professional interactions. The way Liam's eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the careful attention he paid to her words, the strength in his hands as he gestured while speaking. "Grace, I need to ask you something personal," Liam said carefully. "The security experts want to know about anyone who might be important to you, anyone whose safety could be used as leverage if Dominic becomes desperate." The question made Grace realize how isolated her life had become since her mother's death. "There is no one," she admitted quietly. "My mother was my only close family, and I have not maintained friendships since I became focused on paying off her medical debt. I suppose my isolation was good for security, even if it was not good for happiness." Liam's expression softened with understanding that went beyond professional sympathy. "I know something about isolation. Building this company became my entire life after my parents died. I convinced myself that work was enough, that success was a substitute for connection." Grace felt a flutter of recognition at his admission. "Did it work?" "No," Liam replied honestly. "Success without someone to share it with just becomes another form of loneliness. I think I had forgotten that until I watched you risk everything for principle. You reminded me what courage looks like, what integrity costs." Their conversation was interrupted by Grace's phone ringing with a call from Sarah Chen. The news was both encouraging and alarming. Federal investigators had obtained warrants for Dominic's arrest, but he had disappeared, leaving behind only empty bank accounts and a trail of deleted communications. "He is running," Grace said after ending the call, "which means he knows the evidence against him is overwhelming." Liam moved his chair closer to hers, their proximity creating a warmth that had nothing to do with the apartment's heating system. "It also means he is desperate, and desperate criminals make dangerous decisions. The security team wants to relocate you to a more secure location until he is apprehended." Grace felt a moment of panic at the thought of more upheaval, more isolation from the normal world. How long could that take? "Days, weeks, possibly longer if he has planned an escape route," Liam answered honestly. "Grace, I want you to know that you do not have to face this alone. If you are willing, I would like to coordinate my schedule so that we can work on the investigation together. You should not have to carry this burden by yourself." The offer surprised Grace with its personal nature, going far beyond professional obligation into territory that felt remarkably like partnership. "Would that not create complications for you? I am still essentially unemployed, and you are the chief executive officer of a major corporation. You are the person who saved my company and exposed one of the largest corporate thefts in recent memory," Liam replied firmly. "Your employment status is irrelevant compared to your character and your contribution to justice." Grace felt tears threaten, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "I would like that very much. Working together, I mean." They spent the next hour reviewing financial evidence, their heads close together as they examined documents on Grace's laptop screen. Grace found herself intensely aware of Liam's presence beside her, the scent of his cologne, the warmth of his shoulder occasionally brushing against hers, the way his voice dropped to a more intimate tone when they were alone. "Grace," Liam said suddenly, looking up from the computer screen to meet her eyes directly. "I need you to know something. What started as professional respect has become something deeper. I admire your courage, your intelligence, your integrity, but I also find myself caring about your happiness in ways that go beyond gratitude." The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Grace felt her heart racing as she realized that her growing feelings for Liam were reciprocated, that their partnership under extraordinary circumstances had created an emotional connection neither of them had anticipated. "I feel it too," Grace admitted quietly. "I have never been in a situation where someone saw my worth so clearly, where someone trusted my judgment so completely. It is changing how I see myself, and how I see the possibility of being valued for who I am rather than who I should be." Liam reached across the small space between them and gently touched her hand, the contact sending electricity through Grace's entire body. "You are remarkable, Grace Miller. You have courage that most people will never possess, intelligence that I respect completely, and integrity that I find inspiring." Their faces were inches apart, the investigation forgotten as they acknowledged the attraction that had been building between them since their first real conversation in his office. Grace felt drawn toward Liam by something stronger than gratitude or professional respect, a connection that felt like the beginning of authentic love. The moment was interrupted by urgent knocking at the apartment door, followed by the voice of Grace's security officer announcing that federal agents needed to speak with her immediately. The outside world intruded on their private moment, reminding them that their growing relationship existed in the context of criminal investigation and personal danger. As they prepared to face whatever news awaited them, Grace realized that her feelings for Liam had transformed the stakes of the entire situation. She was no longer just fighting for justice or vindication. She was fighting for the possibility of a future with a man who saw her true worth and valued her authentic self. The investigation had brought them together, but love was giving them both something worth protecting beyond corporate interests or personal vindication. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as partners in every sense of the word. The federal courthouse buzzed with media attention as Grace prepared to give her formal testimony to a grand jury investigating Dominic Vance's criminal enterprise. 3 weeks had passed since his disappearance, and the investigation had expanded to include potential money laundering charges, wire fraud, and conspiracy allegations that could result in decades of prison time. Grace sat in the witness preparation room with Sarah Chen, reviewing testimony that would either solidify the government's case or provide defense attorneys with ammunition to discredit her credibility. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever, knowing that $32 million in stolen money and Dominic's freedom hung in the balance of her ability to present complex financial evidence clearly and convincingly. "Grace, remember that the defense will try to portray you as financially motivated to make false accusations," Sarah reminded her. "Your integrity throughout this process has been exemplary, but they will focus on your employment termination and your personal financial situation." "I understand," Grace replied, though she felt nervous about facing hostile questioning from experienced criminal defense attorneys. "The evidence speaks for itself, regardless of their attempts to attack my character." Liam entered the preparation room, carrying news that sent adrenaline through Grace's system. "Federal agents have located Dominic in the Cayman Islands. He was attempting to access offshore accounts containing approximately $8 million in stolen funds when he was arrested." The news was simultaneously relieving and terrifying. Grace felt vindicated by the confirmation that Dominic had been stealing money exactly as she had alleged, but she also realized that his arrest meant the case would proceed to criminal trial, where she would face intensive cross-examination designed to destroy her credibility. "Grace," Liam said, sitting beside her with the natural closeness that had developed between them over the past weeks. "I want you to know that regardless of what happens in the courtroom, you have already accomplished something extraordinary. You exposed a massive theft, you saved the company, and you demonstrated courage that most people will never possess." Their relationship had deepened during the weeks of working together on the investigation, developing from professional partnership into something that felt remarkably like love, though neither had spoken the words explicitly. Grace found comfort in Liam's presence that went beyond gratitude or professional support, and she could see in his eyes a tenderness that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with genuine affection. The grand jury testimony lasted 4 hours, with Grace presenting evidence with the same methodical precision that had first revealed the financial discrepancies. She answered every question honestly and completely, never allowing hostile questioning to shake her commitment to truth. When she finally emerged from the courthouse, Grace felt emotionally drained but professionally triumphant. The prosecutor had indicated that her testimony was compelling and that the grand jury appeared convinced of Dominic's guilt based on the evidence she had presented. Liam was waiting for her outside the courthouse, and Grace felt her heart lift at the sight of his familiar figure among the crowd of reporters and legal observers. He approached her with an expression of admiration and relief that made Grace realize how much his opinion had come to matter to her. "How did it go?" he asked, though her expression had already answered his question. "I told the truth as clearly and completely as I could," Grace replied. "Now it is up to the justice system to determine whether truth is enough to convict a sophisticated criminal." They walked together toward the parking garage, their conversation interrupted by a reporter who recognized Grace as the whistleblower whose allegations had triggered the investigation. "Miss Miller, do you feel vindicated by Dominic Vance's arrest in the Cayman Islands?" Grace paused, considering her response carefully. "I feel grateful that the investigation has confirmed what the evidence suggested all along, that Hill Industries' clients and shareholders were being systematically robbed by someone they trusted. My goal was never vindication. It was justice." The reporter pressed for additional comments, but Liam smoothly guided Grace away from the impromptu interview, his protective instincts evident in the way he positioned himself between her and the cameras. Once they reached the privacy of Liam's car, Grace felt the tension of the day beginning to fade, replaced by relief and something that felt remarkably like happiness. For the first time since discovering the financial discrepancies, she felt that justice was not just possible but probable. "Grace," Liam said as they drove through the city, "I have something I need to tell you. The board of directors met yesterday to discuss the investigation and its aftermath. They voted unanimously to offer you a permanent position with Hill Industries as Director of Financial Ethics and Oversight." The offer surprised Grace with its scope and its implications. She would not just be returning to employment, she would be taking on a leadership role that recognized her skills and her integrity. "That is incredibly generous, but are you certain it is wise to hire someone who has been the center of so much media attention?" "We are certain it is wise to hire someone whose courage and competence saved the company from complete destruction," Liam replied firmly. "Grace, you are not just a whistleblower or a witness. You are someone with demonstrated ability to identify problems that others miss and the integrity to address them regardless of personal cost." Grace felt overwhelmed by the recognition that her career prospects had been transformed by the same courage that had initially threatened to destroy her professional reputation. "I would be honored to accept the position." As they continued driving, Grace realized that her life had been fundamentally reconstructed through the process of fighting for justice. She had gained not just employment and financial security, but also the respect of people whose opinions mattered to her and the beginning of what felt like genuine love with someone who valued her authentic self. "Liam," she said quietly, I need you to know that none of this would have been possible without your willingness to listen to me, to trust my judgment, and to support me when everyone else would have dismissed my allegations as vindictive fiction. You gave me something precious, Liam replied, reaching across to briefly touch her hand. You reminded me what integrity looks like when it is tested and what courage costs when it is genuine. Working with you has changed how I think about leadership, about trust, and about what kind of person I want to be. Their conversation was developing into territory that felt increasingly personal and increasingly important when Grace's phone rang with news that would test both their professional partnership and their growing personal connection. The call was from federal prosecutors with information that would determine whether Dominic Vance faced decades in prison or found legal loopholes that could reduce his charges significantly. Grace answered the phone, her hand unconsciously reaching for Liam's as she prepared to hear news that would define the ultimate success or failure of her decision to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences to herself or anyone else she had come to care about. The news from federal prosecutors was both triumphant and concerning. Dominic Vance had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, which meant he would provide evidence about additional financial crimes, but would likely serve only 8 to 12 years in prison instead of the maximum 30-year sentence. Grace sat in Liam's office, no longer as a visitor but as the newly appointed Director of Financial Ethics, processing the mixed emotions that came with partial justice. The stolen money would be recovered, additional crimes would be exposed, but the man who had systematically robbed the company and orchestrated her termination would avoid the full consequences of his actions. I understand your frustration, Liam said, watching Grace struggle with the compromise inherent in plea negotiations. Part of me wants to see Dominic face maximum penalties for what he did to the company and to you personally. But his cooperation will help recover more stolen funds and potentially expose other criminals. Grace appreciated Liam's attempt to find positive aspects in the legal resolution, but she felt conflicted about celebrating justice that felt incomplete. I suppose I expected that doing the right thing would result in perfect outcomes. Reality is more complicated than moral clarity. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah Chen entering the office with news that would shift Grace's attention from legal proceedings to immediate personal concerns. Grace, we need to discuss your security situation. Dominic's cooperation includes information about criminal associates who may view you as a continuing threat to their operations. The words sent ice through Grace's veins. She had assumed that Dominic's arrest would end the danger to her personal safety, but apparently her role as the primary witness had created ongoing security risks that could last for months or years. Liam immediately moved closer to Grace, his protective instincts overriding professional boundaries. What kind of additional threats are we discussing? Sarah's expression was serious but not panicked. Organized financial crime often involves networks of criminals who protect their operations by intimidating witnesses. The FBI wants to maintain protective measures until they are certain that Grace is not being targeted by Dominic's associates. Grace felt overwhelmed by the realization that speaking truth had committed her to a life of ongoing vigilance and restricted freedom. How long could this continue? Months, possibly longer if the investigation expands to include additional criminal networks, Sarah answered honestly. I know this is not what you expected when you decided to expose the theft, but sophisticated criminals create sophisticated dangers. Liam stood and walked to his office window, his expression reflecting internal struggle between wanting to protect Grace and recognizing the limitations of his ability to shield her from federal criminal proceedings. When he turned back to face her, Grace saw something in his eyes that looked remarkably like determination. Grace, he said carefully, I have a suggestion that may address both the security concerns and the practical challenges of maintaining your normal life while the investigation continues. Grace waited for him to continue, though she sensed from his tone that his suggestion would be both unexpected and significant. My house has extensive security systems, multiple guest accommodations, and grounds that would make surveillance easier for federal agents. If you would be comfortable with the arrangement, you could stay there until the security threats diminish. The offer surprised Grace with its personal nature and its implications for their growing relationship. Living in Liam's house would provide safety and convenience, but it would also accelerate the intimacy between them in ways that felt both appealing and overwhelming. That is incredibly generous, Grace replied carefully, but would that not create complications for both of us? Professional boundaries, personal expectations, media speculation if reporters discovered the arrangement. Liam's response revealed the depth of his feelings with startling clarity. Grace, my professional respect for you has evolved into something much deeper and more personal. I care about your safety, not just as your employer, but as someone whose happiness has become important to my own. If you would be comfortable with closer proximity, I would welcome the opportunity to spend more time together. The admission hung between them like a bridge towards something that felt remarkably like love. Though Grace still felt uncertain about crossing that bridge, given the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. I care about you too, Grace admitted quietly, but I want to be certain that what we feel for each other is genuine, rather than just the intensity that comes from shared crisis and mutual gratitude. Liam smiled at her honesty, recognizing the wisdom in her caution. Then let us use the time together to discover what exists between us beyond professional partnership. No pressure, no expectations, just the opportunity to know each other as people rather than just colleagues. Sarah Chen cleared her throat, reminding them of her presence and the practical security decisions that needed to be made immediately. If you decide on this arrangement, we would need to coordinate with federal agents to ensure that Liam's property can be adequately secured without compromising either of your movements. Grace realized that her decision about living arrangements would also be a decision about allowing her relationship with Liam to develop naturally, rather than being constrained by artificial professional distance. She had spent months being invisible and isolated. Perhaps it was time to risk being seen and known by someone who valued her authentic self. I would like to try the arrangement, Grace said, meeting Liam's eyes with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. With the understanding that we are both learning how to navigate personal feelings in the context of professional partnership. Liam's smile transformed his entire expression, revealing warmth and tenderness that Grace had only glimpsed during their most private conversations. I think we can figure it out together. After all, we have already accomplished something that seemed impossible. We exposed $32 million in theft and saved a company from destruction. As they began discussing practical arrangements for the living situation, Grace realized that her life had evolved far beyond her original goal of simply doing the right thing about financial discrepancies. She had gained not just vindication and career advancement, but also the beginning of what felt like authentic love with someone who saw her worth clearly and valued her courage completely. The investigation was moving toward resolution, but Grace's personal story was just beginning to unfold in ways that promised happiness she had never dared to imagine possible. Liam's house surprised Grace with its warmth and understated elegance, lacking the ostentatious luxury she had expected from a successful CEO's residence. The guest wing provided privacy while keeping her close enough for both security and companionship, and Grace found herself genuinely comfortable in the space that would be her home for the foreseeable future. 3 days into the new living arrangement, Grace discovered that sharing daily life with Liam revealed aspects of his character that had been hidden behind professional formality. He was an excellent cook who enjoyed preparing elaborate breakfasts, a voracious reader who owned first editions of books she had loved since childhood, and someone whose humor emerged naturally when he felt relaxed and unguarded. "Grace," Liam called from the kitchen as she descended the stairs on Friday morning. "I made extra coffee because I noticed you drink approximately 3 cups before noon, and I wanted to ensure adequate supply for optimal functioning." Grace smiled at his careful attention to her preferences, touched by the consideration he showed for details that most people would never notice. "You have been paying very close attention to my caffeine consumption patterns. I pay attention to everything about you," Liam replied, his tone suggesting that his interest went far beyond professional courtesy. "I find you endlessly fascinating. Your thought processes, your problem-solving methods, your ability to remain gracious under pressure that would destroy most people's composure." Their morning conversation was interrupted by a phone call from Michael Torres, with news that would test both their professional partnership and their developing personal relationship. The forensic audit had uncovered evidence that additional Hill Industries employees had been involved in facilitating Dominic's theft, including someone in the Human Resources Department. "Vivian Holloway?" Grace asked immediately, though she already knew the answer. "The investigation suggests she was aware of irregularities in Dominic's expense reports and chose not to report them in exchange for continued employment security," Michael confirmed. "She may also have provided him with information about employees who were asking questions about financial discrepancies." The news hit Grace like a physical blow, confirming that her termination had been orchestrated not just by Dominic, but also by the woman who had dismissed her with such class-based condescension. Vivian had not just been complicit in the theft. She had actively participated in silencing the one person who could expose the crime. Liam immediately moved to Grace's side, his protective instincts evident in the way he positioned himself close enough to offer comfort without crowding her. "Grace, I am so sorry. You deserved support from Human Resources, not betrayal by someone whose job was to protect employees." Grace felt anger rising in her chest, but it was clean anger directed at genuine injustice rather than personal vindictiveness. "She made me feel ashamed of my financial situation, my background, my lack of expensive clothing, all while she was helping someone steal $32 million from the company that employed us both." The investigation into Vivian's complicity would require additional testimony from Grace, more legal proceedings, and more media attention focused on her role as the whistleblower who had exposed corruption at multiple levels. Grace felt exhausted by the prospect of continued legal battles, but she also felt determined to see justice completed thoroughly. "You do not have to face this alone," Liam said quietly, reading her emotions with accuracy that suggested deep attention to her feelings. "Whatever additional proceedings are required, we will handle them together." Grace looked at Liam, recognizing that his support had evolved from professional obligation into genuine partnership based on mutual respect and growing affection. "I know that supporting me creates complications for you and for the company. Are you certain you want to continue this association?" Liam's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Grace, supporting you is not a complication, it is a privilege. You demonstrated more courage and integrity in one day than most people show in their entire careers. I would be honored to stand beside you through whatever challenges remain." Their conversation moved from the kitchen to Liam's study, where Grace had been reviewing additional financial documents as part of her new role with the company. Working together in the same space had created natural intimacy as they discovered shared approaches to problem-solving and complementary skills that made them effective partners. "Grace," Liam said as they settled into comfortable chairs near his fireplace, "I want to ask you something personal, and I want you to feel completely free to decline if the question makes you uncomfortable." Grace felt her pulse quicken at the serious tone in his voice, though his expression suggested curiosity rather than concern. What would you like to know? I would like to know about your dreams for the future. Not your career goals or your financial objectives, but your personal hopes for what kind of life would make you genuinely happy. The question surprised Grace with its depth and its implications. No one had ever asked her about happiness as distinct from survival or success, and she found herself considering possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. I would like to feel valued for who I am, rather than what I can provide, Grace answered honestly. I would like to work on projects that matter, to contribute to something meaningful, to be seen as essential rather than disposable. And I would like to be loved by someone who knows me completely and chooses me anyway. Liam's expression softened as she spoke, and Grace realized that her description of happiness aligned remarkably well with what their relationship was beginning to offer her. You are already valued for who you are, Liam said quietly. Your intelligence, your integrity, your courage, your compassion, those are the qualities that make you essential, Grace. Not your job performance or your financial status or your ability to meet someone else's expectations. The sincerity in his voice sent warmth through Grace that had nothing to do with the fireplace and everything to do with recognition that she was being seen and appreciated for her authentic self. What about your dreams? Grace asked, turning the question back to him. What would make Liam Hill genuinely happy? Connection, Liam replied without hesitation. I built this company as a way to honor my parents' legacy, but I realize now that success without someone to share it with is just another form of isolation. I want partnership, Grace. I want someone whose happiness matters as much as my own. Someone whose dreams become as important to me as my achievements. Their eyes met across the study, and Grace felt the last barriers between them dissolving as they acknowledged what had been building between them since their first real conversation in his corner office. Professional partnership had evolved into genuine friendship. Friendship had deepened into affection, and affection was becoming something that felt remarkably like love. The evening light was fading outside Liam's study windows as they continued talking, sharing stories and dreams and fears that revealed the depth of compatibility between them. Grace realized that fighting for justice had not just vindicated her courage, it had led her to someone who valued her worth and saw her future as intertwined with his own. As they prepared for dinner together, Grace reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in her life over the past months. She had gained not just professional recognition and financial security, but also something she had never dared to hope for, the beginning of authentic love with someone who knew her completely and chose her anyway. The investigation was reaching its conclusion, but Grace's real life was just beginning. The federal investigation into Vivian Holloway's complicity revealed a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond Grace's termination. As Grace reviewed the evidence in Liam's study, she discovered that Vivian had systematically suppressed complaints from other employees who had questioned financial irregularities, creating a culture of silence that enabled Dominic's theft to continue unchallenged for years. She destroyed careers to protect her own position, Grace said, studying personnel files that showed a disturbing pattern of retaliations against conscientious employees. At least 7 people were terminated or demoted after raising concerns about accounting practices. Liam sat beside her on the leather sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched as they examined documents spread across the coffee table. The physical proximity that had once felt awkward now felt natural, a reflection of the emotional intimacy that had developed between them during weeks of shared purpose and mutual discovery. Grace, looking at this evidence, I realized that you were not just brave, you were necessary. Without your courage to speak up, this corruption could have continued indefinitely. Liam's voice carried admiration that went far beyond professional respect. You saved more than money. You saved the integrity of everything my family built. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for the other employees who had been silenced before her. I wish I had spoken up sooner. Maybe those other people would not have lost their jobs if I had acted on my suspicions earlier. You acted when you had sufficient evidence to be credible, Liam replied gently. Second-guessing your timing does not honor the courage it took to act at all. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah Chen, arriving with news that would test both their resolve and their growing relationship. Federal prosecutors wanted Grace to testify in additional proceedings against Vivian Holloway, but doing so would extend the media attention and security concerns for several more months. The prosecution believes your testimony is essential to establishing the pattern of retaliation that enabled the theft, Sarah explained. But I need to be honest about what this means for your personal life. Extended proceedings will maintain public scrutiny and potential security risks indefinitely. Grace looked at Liam, seeing concern in his expression that was both professional and deeply personal. She realized that her decision about testifying would affect not just her own future, but also their developing relationship and his company's recovery. What does your instinct tell you? Liam asked quietly, his question acknowledging her right to choose without pressure from his preferences or business considerations. Grace considered the question seriously, thinking about the 7 employees who had been silenced before her, about the culture of fear that had protected criminal behavior, and about her mother's teaching that integrity meant doing what was right, regardless of personal cost. My instinct tells me that incomplete justice is not really justice at all, Grace answered. If I stop fighting now, Vivian escapes full accountability, and other companies learn that systematic retaliation is an effective strategy for suppressing whistleblowers. Liam's expression reflected pride, mixed with concern. I support whatever decision you make, but I need you to know that continued proceedings mean continued risks for both of us. Both of us, Grace questioned, though she suspected she understood his meaning. Grace, what has developed between us goes far beyond professional partnership or shared crisis. I care about you in ways that make your safety essential to my own happiness. Liam's admission was delivered with quiet intensity that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. If you choose to continue testifying, I choose to continue supporting you, regardless of the complications for me, personally or professionally. Grace felt her heart race at his declaration, recognizing that they had crossed the threshold from growing attraction into something that felt unmistakably like love. Are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying that I love you, Grace Miller, Liam replied without hesitation. I love your courage, your intelligence, your integrity, and your compassion. I love the way you see problems that others miss and the way you refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. I love who you are, and I love who I become when I'm with you. The words hung between them like a bridge toward a future neither had dared to imagine weeks earlier. Grace felt tears of joy threatening as she realized that her fight for justice had led not just to vindication, but to authentic love with someone who valued her true self completely. I love you too, Grace whispered, the admission feeling both overwhelming and perfectly natural. I love your principles, your leadership, your kindness, and the way you make me feel valuable rather than disposable. I love that you see my worth when I sometimes struggle to see it myself. Liam moved closer, his hand gently touching her face as their conversation shifted from legal strategy to personal commitment. Grace, I want you to know that whatever challenges we face with additional proceedings, we face them together. Your fight for justice has become our fight for justice. Their first kiss was tender and full of promise, sealing not just romantic commitment, but also partnership in every aspect of their lives. Grace realized that exposing $32 million in theft had led her to something more valuable than money or professional success. It had led her to love based on mutual respect and shared values. Sarah Chen cleared her throat diplomatically, reminding them of the legal decisions that required immediate attention. I hate to interrupt, but we need to respond to the prosecution's request by tomorrow morning. Grace looked at Liam, seeing her own determination reflected in his expression. We testify, she said firmly. We see this through to complete justice, regardless of how long it takes or what it costs. Liam smiled at her decision, his pride in her courage evident in every aspect of his expression. Then we prepare for extended battle, and we prepare together. As they began planning for additional testimony and continued legal proceedings, Grace realized that her transformation from invisible receptionist to courageous leader was nearly complete. She had found her voice, claimed her worth, and discovered love that celebrated rather than diminished her authentic self. The investigation had brought them together, but love had given them both something worth protecting that extended far beyond corporate interests or personal vindication. Whatever challenges remained, they would face them as partners united by justice, strengthened by adversity, and committed to truth above all other considerations. Their love story had begun with a last-day confrontation with power, but it would be sustained by daily choices to value integrity over convenience and partnership over individual safety. Grace Elizabeth Miller was no longer invisible, and she would never be overlooked again. The additional testimony against Vivian Holloway required Grace to relive the humiliation of her termination. But this time, she spoke from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The federal courthouse was packed with media representatives and legal observers, as Grace presented evidence that would determine whether corporate retaliation against whistleblowers would face serious legal consequences. Miss Miller, please describe the circumstances of your termination meeting with Vivian Holloway, the federal prosecutor requested, her voice carrying the authority of someone seeking justice for systematic abuse of power. Grace sat in the witness box with composure that reflected months of growth and self-discovery. Miss Holloway informed me that I was being terminated not for performance reasons, but because I did not fit the company's sophisticated image. She specifically referenced my financial situation and personal background as unsuitable for a prestigious organization. The prosecutor continued her questioning with precision designed to establish clear patterns of discrimination. Did Miss Holloway provide any legitimate business justification for her assessment of your suitability? No, Grace answered firmly. My performance reviews had been consistently excellent. I had never received complaints about my work, and I had frequently been praised for managing complex scheduling challenges that other employees found impossible to handle. In the gallery, Grace could see Liam watching her testimony with admiration and concern, his presence providing strength that helped her maintain clarity under aggressive cross-examination from Vivian's defense attorney. Miss Miller, is it not true that your allegations against Miss Holloway are motivated by personal resentment about your termination, rather than genuine concern about corporate ethics? The defense attorney's question was designed to undermine her credibility through character assassination. Grace had prepared for this line of attack, and her response reflected the confidence that came from knowing her motivations were pure. My concern about corporate ethics began months before my termination, when I first noticed financial discrepancies that suggested systematic theft. My termination was a consequence of those ethical concerns, not the cause of them. The cross-examination continued for 3 hours, with defense attorneys attempting to portray Grace as a vindictive former employee whose allegations were driven by financial desperation rather than genuine whistleblowing. But Grace's consistent testimony and documented evidence proved stronger than character attacks. When Grace finally left the witness stand, she felt emotionally exhausted but morally vindicated. The prosecutor had indicated that her testimony was compelling and that the jury appeared convinced of Vivian's guilt based on the evidence presented. Liam was waiting for her outside the courtroom with an expression that reflected both relief and profound pride. "Grace, you were extraordinary in there. You maintained your composure under hostile questioning and presented the truth with absolute clarity." "I had good preparation and excellent motivation," Grace replied, her smile acknowledging both the legal coaching she had received and the personal support that had sustained her through the ordeal. As they walked toward the courthouse parking garage, they were approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Jennifer Walsh, one of the employees whose complaint about financial irregularities had been suppressed by Vivian Holloway 3 years earlier. "Miss Miller, I wanted to thank you," Jennifer said, her voice carrying emotion that suggested deep gratitude. "When I tried to report discrepancies in expense accounts, Miss Holloway told me I was being paranoid and threatened my job security if I continued asking questions. Your courage gave voice to concerns that many of us shared but were afraid to express." The encounter reminded Grace that her fight for justice had implications far beyond her personal vindication. Other employees had been silenced, intimidated, and professionally damaged by the same corruption that had targeted her, and her testimony was providing them with belated justice. "Thank you for speaking with me," Grace replied to Jennifer. "I wish I had known about your experiences earlier. Maybe we could have stopped the theft sooner if employees had felt safe reporting their concerns." "That is exactly why your testimony matters so much," Jennifer responded. "You are not just exposing past corruption, you are making future corruption harder to conceal by showing other employees that speaking up can lead to justice rather than just retaliation." As Jennifer departed, Grace realized that her role as a whistleblower had evolved into something larger and more significant than personal vindication. She had become a symbol of employee empowerment and corporate accountability that would inspire others to speak truth to power. "Grace," Liam said as they reached his car, "what Jennifer said is important. Your courage has created ripple effects that extend far beyond Hill Industries. You have changed how employees think about their rights and responsibilities when they witness corporate wrongdoing." Grace felt overwhelmed by the recognition that her decision to expose financial discrepancies had transformed not just her own life, but also the professional landscape for countless other employees who had previously felt powerless against corporate intimidation. The drive home was quiet, both Grace and Liam processing the emotional intensity of the day's proceedings and the broader implications of the justice they were seeking. Grace found comfort in Liam's presence beside her, his steady support providing stability that allowed her to maintain focus on the larger purpose of their shared struggle. "Liam," Grace said as they entered his house, "I need you to know something. When I first walked into your office with evidence of Dominic's theft, I was hoping for justice. I never imagined that seeking justice would lead me to love, partnership, and a sense of purpose that extends far beyond my personal circumstances." Liam took her hands in his expression reflecting the depth of his own transformation through their shared experience. "Oh, Grace, you gave me something precious. You showed me what real leadership looks like when it is tested, and what integrity costs when it is genuine. You changed not just my company, but also my understanding of what makes life meaningful." Their conversation moved from the entryway to the kitchen, where they prepared dinner, together with the natural coordination that had developed during weeks of shared domestic routine. Grace realized that their love had been built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that would sustain them through whatever challenges remained. As they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Grace felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal victories and everything to do with finding someone who valued her authentic self and shared her commitment to principles above convenience. Tomorrow would bring additional legal proceedings, more media attention, and continued security concerns. But tonight, Grace Elizabeth Miller was home with someone who loved her completely, fighting for justice alongside someone who shared her values and building a future based on truth rather than compromise. The girl who had once been invisible had become impossible to overlook, and the love she had found was as authentic and enduring as the courage that had led her to speak truth regardless of consequences. 6 weeks later, Grace stood before a packed auditorium at the Federal Building, no longer as a nervous witness, but as the keynote speaker at the National Conference on Corporate Ethics and Employee Rights. The transformation from invisible receptionist to nationally recognized advocate for workplace justice had been swift and profound. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing her message could change lives. "I want to tell you about the power of paying attention to details that others choose to ignore, and about what happens when ordinary employees decide that truth matters more than job security." The audience included corporate executives, federal investigators, employee rights advocates, and journalists who had followed her story from the initial press conference through the successful prosecutions that had resulted in significant prison sentences for both Dominic Vance and Vivian Holloway. Grace's speech outlined practical strategies for creating corporate cultures that encouraged reporting of financial irregularities rather than punishing employees who asked inconvenient questions. Her recommendations were based not just on academic research, but on lived experience of both corporate retaliation and eventual vindication. The most sophisticated theft operations succeed not because they are invisible, but because they train employees to look away from what they can see clearly, Grace explained. Creating ethical workplaces requires changing the incentive structure so that employees are rewarded for attention to detail rather than punished for uncomfortable observations. In the front row, Liam watched with unmistakable pride as Grace delivered a presentation that was both professionally polished and deeply personal. 6 months earlier, she had been managing his calendar while eating dollar store lunches. Today, she was shaping national policy on corporate accountability. After her presentation, Grace was approached by representatives from 3 major corporations requesting consulting services to help them develop ethical reporting systems. The woman who had once been fired for being unsuitable for company image was now being recruited by companies seeking to improve their ethical standards. "Miss Miller," said Margaret Torres, Chief Ethics Officer at a Fortune 500 company, "we would like to retain your services to review our financial oversight procedures and train our employees on identifying and reporting potential fraud. Your unique perspective, as someone who has experienced both retaliation and vindication, would be invaluable to our staff." Grace accepted the business card with gratitude that extended beyond professional opportunity. "I would be honored to work with your organization. Creating systems that protect rather than punish ethical employees has become my passion." As the conference concluded, Grace and Liam walked together through downtown streets that had become familiar during months of legal proceedings. The media attention had finally subsided, security concerns had been resolved, and their personal relationship had evolved from crisis partnership into genuine partnership in every aspect of their lives. "Grace," Liam said as they paused near the fountain where Grace had sometimes eaten lunch during her days as a receptionist, "I have something important to ask you, and I want to ask it here because this place represents your transformation from invisible to essential." Grace felt her heart race as Liam knelt beside the fountain, producing a small velvet box that contained a diamond ring whose elegant simplicity reflected her personal style perfectly. "Grace Elizabeth Miller," Liam said, his voice carrying emotion that made several passers-by stop to watch. "You changed my life by showing me what courage looks like when it is tested, and what love feels like when it is based on authentic knowledge of each other's character. Will you marry me?" The proposal was witnessed by strangers who had followed Grace's story in the media, and their spontaneous applause created a moment of public celebration that felt both overwhelming and perfect. Grace realized that accepting Liam's proposal would complete her transformation from someone who existed on the margins of other people's lives to someone whose happiness was central to another person's future. "Yes," Grace answered, her voice carrying across the plaza with the same clarity that had characterized her testimony in federal court. "Yes, I will marry you, because you saw my worth when I could not see it myself, and because you love me for who I am rather than who I might become." As Liam placed the ring on her finger, Grace felt the last remnants of her old insecurities dissolving completely. She was no longer the woman who ate alone while managing other people's important meetings. She had become someone whose own meetings were attended by corporate executives seeking her expertise, whose opinions influenced national policy, and whose love story had begun with the courage to speak truth to power. The small crowd that had gathered to watch the proposal included several people who recognized Grace from media coverage, and their congratulations reflected genuine admiration for someone whose personal journey had inspired broader conversations about workplace courage and corporate accountability. "Miss Miller," called out a young woman who identified herself as a recent business school graduate, "your story gave me courage to report financial irregularities at my internship. I wanted to thank you for showing that doing the right thing can lead to positive outcomes rather than just professional suicide." Grace felt tears of gratitude for the recognition that her personal struggle had created positive change in other people's lives. "Thank you for speaking up. Every person who refuses to ignore wrongdoing makes it easier for the next person to choose integrity over silence." As Grace and Liam walked hand in hand toward their future together, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months earlier, she had been invisible, insecure, and convinced that her worth was determined by other people's approval. Today, she was engaged to a man who celebrated her authentic self, building a consulting practice that would help other employees find their voices, and serving as living proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through courage and integrity. The girl who had been fired for being too poor had become rich in every way that truly mattered. Rich in love, rich in purpose, rich in respect, and rich in the knowledge that her life had meaning beyond her own happiness. Grace Elizabeth Miller would never be invisible again, because she had learned to see her own worth clearly and to speak her own truth fearlessly. Hill Industries' annual shareholder meeting took place exactly 1 year after Grace's initial confrontation with Dominic Vance. But the company presenting its results bore little resemblance to the organization that had nearly been destroyed by systematic theft. Under Grace's leadership as Chief Ethics Officer and Liam's reformed management approach, Hill Industries had become an industry leader in corporate transparency and employee empowerment. Grace stood at the podium addressing shareholders, board members, and media representatives who had gathered to hear about the company's remarkable recovery and transformation. Her professional evolution from receptionist to corporate executive was visible not just in her confident demeanor, but in the respect with which she was treated by everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grace began, "1 year ago, Hill Industries faced potential bankruptcy due to $32 million in theft that had been concealed through systematic intimidation of employees who asked uncomfortable questions. Today, I am pleased to report that we have not only recovered those stolen funds, but we have also created an ethical framework that generated record profits through improved employee morale and client confidence. The financial results she presented were impressive by any standard. Hill Industries had not just survived the scandal, it had thrived by implementing transparency measures that attracted clients specifically seeking ethical business partners. The company's stock price had risen 38% above pre-scandal levels, and employee satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of engagement and trust. Our success demonstrates that ethical business practices are not just morally superior, they are also economically advantageous, Grace continued. When employees feel safe reporting problems rather than hiding them, issues are resolved quickly rather than festering into crises. In the front row, Liam watched his fiancée present results that validated everything they had built together over the past year. Their professional partnership had proven as successful as their personal relationship, with Grace's attention to systemic problems complementing Liam's strategic vision perfectly. After the formal presentation, Grace was approached by David Chen, editor of Corporate Ethics Quarterly, who had been following her story since the initial press conference. "Miss Miller, your transformation of Hill Industries has become a case study in business schools across the country. What advice would you give to other employees who witness financial irregularities but fear retaliation for reporting them?" Grace considered the question seriously, thinking about the 7 employees who had been silenced before her, and the hundreds of people who had contacted her seeking advice about similar situations. Document everything carefully, seek external guidance from employee rights organizations, and remember that your professional worth is not determined by one employer's opinion. Truth has a way of prevailing when it is presented with sufficient evidence and adequate courage. The shareholder meeting concluded with unanimous approval of the company's new ethical policies and a standing ovation for Grace's presentation. As attendees filed out of the auditorium, Grace felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond professional success to encompass personal fulfillment and moral satisfaction. "Grace," Liam said, as they gathered their materials from the podium, "watching you address our shareholders as Chief Ethics Officer, I am struck by how completely you have claimed your place as a leader rather than just a survivor of corporate wrongdoing." Grace smiled at his observation, recognizing the truth in his words. "I no longer think of myself as someone who got lucky or who was rescued by circumstances. I have become someone who identifies problems, develops solutions, and leads change rather than simply hoping someone else will fix things." Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret Torres, the Chief Ethics Officer, who had recruited Grace for consulting work, bringing news that would expand Grace's influence far beyond Hill Industries. "Grace, I wanted to inform you that your consulting methodology has been so successful with our organization that we are recommending your approach to our entire industry consortium. You could potentially influence ethical practices at dozens of major corporations." The opportunity represented career advancement that Grace could never have imagined during her days as a receptionist. But more importantly, it offered the chance to prevent other employees from experiencing the retaliation and intimidation that she had overcome. "I am honored by your confidence," Grace replied, "but I want to ensure that any expansion of my consulting practice maintains focus on protecting individual employees rather than just improving corporate public relations." Margaret Torres nodded approvingly. That authentic commitment to employee welfare, rather than just corporate image, is exactly why your approach generates genuine results, rather than cosmetic improvements. As the meeting concluded and Grace and Liam prepared to leave the building where her professional journey had begun, Grace paused at the reception desk where her replacement was efficiently managing phone calls and appointments. The young woman looked up with polite professionalism that reminded Grace of her former self. "Miss Miller," the receptionist said with obvious recognition, "I wanted to thank you for creating an environment where employees like me feel valued rather than invisible. Knowing that my observations and concerns would be taken seriously makes me feel genuinely important to the company's success." Grace felt tears threaten at the recognition that her struggle had created meaningful change in other people's daily experience. "Thank you for saying that. Remember that your position gives you unique insights into how the company actually functions. Your attention to detail and your observations matter more than you might realize." As Grace and Liam left Hill Industries together, Grace reflected on the complete transformation of her relationship with the building, the company, and most importantly, with herself. She had entered as someone desperate for approval and financial security. She was leaving as someone whose approval mattered to others and whose financial security came from her own demonstrated value rather than external charity. The drive home took them past the courthouse where Grace had testified, the plaza where Liam had proposed, and the apartment building where Grace had lived during the most challenging period of the investigation. Each location marked a milestone in her journey, from invisible to essential, from powerless to influential, from alone to beloved. "Liam," Grace said, as they approached the house they now shared permanently, "I want you to know that marrying you next month will not just be a personal celebration. It will be a public statement that love based on authentic character can survive any challenge that external circumstances create." Liam reached across to take her hand, his engagement ring catching light from the setting sun. "Grace, you taught me that real leadership means seeing value in people that they cannot always see in themselves. Our love story began with your courage to speak truth, but it will continue with our commitment to build a life based on those same principles." As they entered their home together, Grace realized that her transformation from Grace Miller, invisible receptionist, to Grace Miller, nationally respected ethics consultant and soon-to-be wife of someone who cherished her authentic self, represented more than personal success. Her story had become proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through courage, integrity, and refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Tomorrow would bring additional consulting opportunities, continued media attention, and the final preparations for a wedding that had captured public imagination as a symbol of love, conquering both corporate corruption and social prejudice. But tonight, Grace Elizabeth Miller was simply home with the man who loved her completely, building a future based on truth rather than compromise. The woman who had once been fired for being too poor had become rich in every way that truly mattered, and her wealth would continue growing as long as she remained true to the principles that had transformed her life and inspired countless others to find their own voices. The wedding of Grace Miller and Liam Hill took place on a perfect autumn morning in the gardens of the Fairmont Hotel, with 300 guests who represented every phase of Grace's remarkable transformation. The ceremony was covered by major media outlets, not just as a society event, but as the culmination of a love story that had begun with courage and been sustained by shared principles. Grace walked down the aisle, wearing her mother's pearl necklace and a dress whose elegant simplicity reflected her authentic style rather than anyone else's expectations. The woman who had once felt ashamed of her modest background now carried herself with confidence that came from knowing her worth was recognized and celebrated by someone who mattered. Among the wedding guests were federal prosecutors who had worked on the case, former Hill Industries employees who had been inspired by Grace's courage to speak up about their own workplace concerns, and corporate executives who had hired Grace to help them create more ethical organizational cultures. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered today to witness the union of two people whose love was forged through adversity and strengthened by shared commitment to justice and integrity." As Grace and Liam exchanged vows they had written themselves, Their words reflected not just personal devotion, but also the principles that had brought them together and would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Grace," Liam said, his voice carrying across the garden with the same certainty that had characterized his support for her throughout the investigation. "I promise to see your worth even when you struggle to see it yourself, to support your courage even when it creates complications for both of us, and to love you not despite your principles, but because of them." Grace's response was delivered with the clarity and strength that had made her testimony so compelling in federal court. "Liam, I promise to speak truth even when it is difficult, to choose integrity even when it is costly, and to love you not for what you can provide, but for who you choose to be when your character is tested." The ceremony concluded with applause that reflected genuine celebration from guests who had witnessed Grace's journey from invisible employee to nationally respected advocate for workplace justice. As Grace and Liam walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Grace felt the profound satisfaction of a life transformed through courage and sustained by love. The reception featured speeches from colleagues, friends, and family members who had supported Grace through her transformation. Michael Torres, the forensic accountant who had verified her initial evidence, spoke about the precision and integrity that had made her testimony so credible. Sarah Chen, the attorney who had guided her through legal proceedings, praised her composure under pressure and commitment to complete justice. But the most moving speech came from Jennifer Walsh, the former Hill Industries employee whose complaint about financial irregularities had been suppressed by Vivian Holloway. Grace gave voice to concerns that many of us shared but were afraid to express. Her courage created a ripple effect that has changed corporate culture in ways that will protect countless future employees from the retaliation that silenced us. As the reception continued into the evening, Grace found herself in quiet conversation with Margaret Torres and several other corporate executives who had become colleagues rather than just clients. They were discussing Grace's plans to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting employees who witness corporate wrongdoing. "The Grace Miller Foundation for Workplace Integrity," Margaret said, "would provide legal support, financial assistance, and professional guidance for employees who face retaliation for reporting corporate misconduct. Your personal experience combined with your professional expertise would make this organization uniquely effective." Grace felt excitement building at the prospect of creating systematic support for employees facing the same intimidation and uncertainty that she had overcome. "I want to ensure that future whistleblowers do not have to choose between financial security and moral integrity. Speaking truth should lead to protection, not punishment." Liam joined their conversation with news that would provide the foundation with immediate credibility and resources. Hill Industries' board of directors has voted to provide initial funding of $2 million for the foundation, and we have commitments from 3 other corporations for additional support. The announcement represented more than financial backing. It demonstrated corporate recognition that protecting ethical employees was both morally necessary and economically advantageous. Grace realized that her personal struggle had evolved into a broader movement that would benefit thousands of future employees. As the wedding reception concluded and guests began departing, Grace and Liam found themselves alone in the hotel garden where they had exchanged vows hours earlier. The fairy lights strung through the trees created an atmosphere of magic that reflected the extraordinary transformation both of their lives had undergone. "Grace," Liam said, taking her hands as they stood beneath the oak tree where they had promised to love and support each other. "1 year ago, you were fired for being too poor to fit corporate image. Today, you are launching a foundation that will change corporate culture permanently. Your journey from invisible to essential has inspired more people than you realize. Grace smiled at her husband, feeling profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. I learned that being overlooked was actually my superpower. It allowed me to see things that powerful people missed. Now I want to help others use their observations to create positive change, rather than just surviving corporate intimidation. As they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, Grace reflected on the complete transformation of her life through courage, integrity, and the unexpected discovery of love with someone who valued her authentic self. She had begun this journey as someone desperate for approval and ended it as someone whose approval mattered to others. The girl who had eaten dollar store soup while managing million-dollar meetings had become a woman whose own foundation would be funded with millions of dollars. The receptionist, who had been fired for inadequate image, had become a nationally respected advocate whose image inspired others to find their voices. Grace Elizabeth Miller Hill, her new name reflecting partnership rather than isolation, would never be invisible again. More importantly, her voice had become a beacon that would help other invisible people claim their own power and speak their own truth, regardless of the consequences. The last day that had threatened to end everything had actually been the first day of a life built on authentic love, meaningful work, and the knowledge that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through courage and integrity. Justice had been served, love had been found, and Grace's transformation from invisible to invaluable was finally, completely, triumphantly complete. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.